Hi, everyone. Welcome to the seminar series by the Institute for Experiential AI. So we have a seminar every other week, expeditions in Experiential AI Seminar series, and we have internal and external speakers that join us. So everyone in the room and everyone online, feel free to listen to the, write your questions while you're listening to the talk. So today we have our very own Agata Lapedriza. So I'm going to read Agata's bio because it's, I don't want to skip anything. So Agata is a principal research scientist with us at the Institute at here, Institute for Experiential AI, and a professor at Universitat Oberta de Catalunya. She is also affiliate professor at Beauvais College of Health Sciences and a research affiliate at MIT Media Lab. Her research focuses on human-centered AI with an emphasis on developing fair and reliable systems that can perceive and understand human behavior, expressions, and contextual information. She specializes in use cases related to social robotics and AI for health and wellness. She was from 2012 to 2015, she was a visiting professor at MIT CSAIL, and where she worked on computer vision and explainable AI. And then she was a research affiliate at MIT Media Lab, where she worked on emotion perception, emotionally aware dialogue systems, and social robotics. In 2020, she spent a year as a visiting faculty at Google. And more recently, 2022-2023, she worked as a part-time contractor at Apple Machine Learning Research. And the topic, as you see, is explainable AI in computer vision. So I got that.
Thank you. Thank you, Jansu, for the introduction. So as Jansu said, I'm going to talk about explainable AI in computer vision today, but concretely, I'm going to give my own perspective based on my own experience, okay? So to start, let's talk a little bit about the history, the most recent history in computer vision, so that we can properly contextualize the explainability in computer vision. And I put here a timeline. It starts in 2003 because it's when computer vision starts for me. It's when I started my PhD. And as you can imagine, the scenario in 2003 was very, very different from what it is now. So first, the community of computer vision was way smaller than it is now. And we were working with these small benchmarks, small data sets, 200 images, 1,000 was already a lot. The type of models I was working with during my PhD, super vector machines, logistic regression, boosting was very popular by then, and getting very poor performance on some problems that nowadays are so easy. So the scenario changed though. I put here a date, 2012, but around 2010, 2012, so we have the first deep learning models in computer vision. So they were not that deep. So this is actually, I think it's the first that is considered a deep learning model. It's called AlexNet. AlexNet is the name of the architecture. And here it has, can you see my mouse? Yes. So it has a few convolutional layers and then 2 fully connected layers. And at that moment, it was first trained to do object recognition. So basically the input was an image and the output was the object category. And it was trained with a large data set. So this was also, so basically what happens around 2010, 2012 is 3 things, right? So we suddenly had access to more computational resources, right? And GPUs. Second, large data sets, which allow to do more complex things. And third, the deep learning models. And so these huge models that are very flexible with a lot of parameters that require a lot of data and a lot of computation to work well. So in that moment, we had ImageNet. So it was one of the first efforts of large-scale data sets. There were others in the past, but they didn't get that popular as ImageNet. And ImageNet allowed to train from scratch these huge models and to do object categorization. So it's an object-centric data set, millions of images, around 1,000 object categories. Then another important issue, important thing, at least in my perspective, is 2014, another data set. In this case, I was involved in the collection of this data set, the Places data set. This is a data set that was led, so the collection was led from MIT. And in this case, it's a scene-centric data set, a place category data set. So basically, we had millions of images of 365 place categories like kitchen, bedroom, city, forest, whatever you can imagine. And then that was nice because you could play with this type of architectures on 2 different computer vision tasks, and you could train from scratch these models in these 2 computer vision tasks and compare what happened there. So since 2014, a lot of things have happened since 2012, actually. So this explosion of deep learning, deeper architectures, other types of architectures that you can, so generative model explosion as well, ResNets, transformers, hybrid models. So this huge explosion in computer vision. So all of the computer vision tasks that you were approaching in the past and nothing was working, now suddenly, they get better and better. So exciting, no? But since the beginning of deep learning, people had these concerns about that they are like these black boxes, right? So in the past, we were working with simpler models that we could understand how they were encoding the information and how they were working internally and how they were defining the boundaries for classification and so on. But suddenly, these models are just black boxes. And that's so the motivation of explainability, we can say that the first works on explainability were published like late 2014 or early 2015, explainability in deep learning and computer vision, I'm saying. But they were addressing this question of, okay, so we don't like black boxes. We are not okay with just having these great performing methods in these benchmarks, but actually not knowing what's going on in these models. So to motivate about a little bit more, a little bit better, this idea that we need more than great performing black boxes. So one of the reasons is that now these models work very well. So of course, there's an increasing number of deep learning uses. And some of them involve important decision-making, right? And that decision-making that has an impact for people and an impact for humans in general. So let me illustrate this idea with one example. So this is a paper, so maybe you know about this paper. This is a paper that was published in Nature in 2017. So in this paper, they were trying to classify skin lesions. So these images that you see here on benign or malign, right? And they were using a convolutional neural network on 100K clinical images. They were annotated with 21 certified dermatologists. And then they were obtaining the same accuracy as the experts with the system. So that's very exciting. But what happened? So 2 years later, so the authors reveal that they noticed a bias in their algorithm. So if we zoom a little bit in two of these images, what they realized, so do you see here there is like a ruler thing here? So what happened with this ruler thing is that there was a spurious correlation. So this ruler was present more often in images that were malign. And the reason was because in those malign lesions, the expert wanted this ruler to properly measure and track the evolution of the malign lesions. And then there was this spurious correlation. So somehow the algorithm was not actually doing the task that it was supposed to be doing, which is looking at these skin lesions and properly separating the different nature of the skin lesions, but the algorithm was smarter and was detecting this visual pattern that was very easy to recognize, but it was not addressing the task that was that we wanted or they wanted to address. So I think that nowadays we have explainability techniques that would have allowed to see this spurious correlation, and I'm going to revisit this example later. So explainability computer vision. So since 2014, there have been a lot of techniques. There are many ways of categorizing explainability in computer vision. I'm going to talk about one possible way of categorizing these methods. And here is one of the classes, which is techniques that try to understand the relation between the input and the output. Okay, so you have, in this case, I'm illustrating a place categorization system. It takes this image as an input and it gives us an output bedroom. So systems that try to answer questions like, what is the model looking at? Or in other words, what parts of the input image are contributing the most for the model to produce this output? But there's another way of approaching explainability, which is addressing the problem of understanding the internal representation learned by the model in general. So not focusing on particular examples, but more generally trying to understand how the model is encoding the input. What is the representation that this model is learning? And we call this type of approaches global explanations, so local and global explanations. I'm going to talk about both of them. Let's start with the first one. Okay, so back to 2014, these were experiments that we were running in 2014. They were published in a paper in 2015, but we were at that moment where, okay, so we have these great methods that are offering this incredible performance on place categorization in images like this one. This was very challenging at that moment. So it was saying, for this image, the system was saying it's a bedroom, high confidence score because we have more than 300 cases, 300 classes, so excellent. But we were starting thinking, okay, so what in the image makes this image a bedroom? And for the case of bedroom, it's pretty evident, right? Because a bedroom is defined as a room where there's a bed. So if I remove the bed, it's not a bedroom anymore. So we thought, okay, what happens if we remove the bed in this image? Okay, so we remove the bed, and suddenly the system was not recognizing this space as a bedroom anymore. It was saying it's a basement. Okay, it makes sense. So then we thought, okay, let's try to do this in a more systematic way. So we were taking images and we were creating this kind of base for the image. So basically we were breaking the image in different pieces using a clustering technique. And then the idea is that you break this image into these pieces so that if you sum, literally you sum all of these images in the right, you get this image, okay? So first breaking the image, and second, we repeated an iterative process as follows. So we started from the image, and then we were removing pieces in a way that we wanted to keep the score for bedroom as high as possible for the model. And we were doing this iteratively until the point that if I remove more information, it's not a bedroom anymore. And we were calling this the minimal image. And we were looking at a lot of minimal images. This is how it looks for one bedroom. This is how it looks for a lot of bedrooms. And if you, I know it's very small, but if you look closer, so it's beds everywhere. So it's the bed. Okay, so that looks good. We were doing this for other categories like dining room. And this is how the minimal image looked like for dining room. So again, there's like some kind of local information in the image that is providing a lot of information for the system to recognize this dining room. And for a lot of dining rooms, you always see this configuration of the chairs and the table as being something very discriminative. So very simple, but at that moment, these techniques that were based on analyzing how the output was changing when making small perturbations in the input started to give a lot of information about how these models were working. This is one example, but there were other people that were working in similar approaches. So very simple as well. You take an image and you just put this black square hiding specific parts of the image, right? In this case, this is a dog. So what happens is that when you occlude the part that is the most discriminative is when you observe the strongest drop in the score of the true category. So again, a way of getting some intuition of what's going on in the models. Okay, but this required a lot of manual inspection. And at some point we thought, okay, can we do something that is somehow more based on a mathematical formulation of the model? And I'm going to talk about class activation maps. So this is a work also published in 2016 with so Boley, Aditya, Ott, and Antonio. So Boley and Aditya were PhD students at MIT at that moment, and Ott and Antonio are two of my collaborators. And the idea of class activation maps, I'm going to explain the original formulation, which is the simplest. So there are so many variants of class activation maps, but I'm going to explain the original one. And I think that you can capture the idea and the interest of this technique. So again, let's imagine that we have a trained model. So we have an input image and we have the categorization in Penguin. So class activation map allows you to produce this heat map that I'm showing here that is highlighting in red the parts of the image that were the most discriminative for the model to make the decision. But there's a mathematical formulation behind that, okay? So it's not about experimenting on changing the image anymore. And let's see how this works, okay? I'm going to show how this works for a very simple architecture. So in this case, we have an architecture, it's called fully convolutional because it's just convolutional layers. And then there's this gap. This is global average pooling, is a type of pooling. But let's try to understand a little bit for those that are not familiar with computer vision, what these convolutional, what these feature maps are. So in this convolution. So let's focus on the last one. And notice that I'm illustrating 3 planes in this 3D box of numbers, okay? 3 planes, the blue, the red, and the green. So these are feature maps. So actually each of these layers, let's focus on the blue one, for instance. So what happens here? You have a convolutional kernel that has been learned while training the model. And then what you do is you compute the convolution of this kernel on the image on different locations of the image, right? So for this location, you produce a value. For this location, you produce another value. So it's a feature map for each of the convolutional kernels. Perfect. And we have different of them. So the global average pooling that I was mentioning before, so we just averaging. So the first one, the blue one, is a single value. that is obtained by averaging all the blue feature map, right? And the red one is the one obtained when you compute the average of all the values in the red feature map and so on. And then right before the output, you have these linear combinations. So these W values are weights, also learned during training, and you compute this linear combination of all of these values that you obtain with the global average pooling to make the final decision. So let's look at this differently. So let's expand these feature maps. So this is how they look, and I'm visualizing them here, with a color scale where red indicates very strong values, very high values, and blue indicate very low values. And you have all these feature maps. So what you can do is compute the same average sum, so the same linear combination, but in the map visualization. And then when you compute this is what it looks like. So it's a combination of how strong in each part of the image, of the regions of the image, each of these feature maps is, right? So actually, if you compute the average of this class activation map that come here, you obtain the same value. So it's nothing crazy. It's just a different way of seeing things. But this is very powerful. And here, this formulation allows you to do this for fully convolutional networks, but then there are so many variants of CAM that you can apply it for networks that have fully connected layers or other types of layers. So there are so many variants. But still, the simple formulation was very powerful at that moment. So we tested it in different computer vision tasks, like these are examples for action classification on single images. And you can see, cleaning the floor, cooking, and fixing a car, different types of actions, and how class activation map was able to reveal the part of the image that was contributing the most to this type of output. And actually, it was coherent. So that was great. That is a way of checking that everything is going well. And you can apply these to other abstract concepts like mirror lake or view out of the window. So here in the mirror lake, you see how CAM highlights this symmetry thing, right? Okay, so class activation map has been also applied to medical image. So here is just one example, but imagine that in medical image, this is particularly relevant because imagine that you have an input and you are trying to recognize pathologies, right, in this X-ray image. And you can have a system that tells you this is pneumonia, and I'm pretty sure 85% probability according to the model that there's pneumonia here. But if you have also this support of a visualization that explains where the model is finding relevant information, for a physician is much easier to know if they can rely or not in these outputs. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the example that I showed before. So I never experimented with these images. I'm not sure if they are available, but I'm pretty sure that this technique would have revealed that the ruler thing was having a surprisingly importance in this decision making, and then revealing this spurious correlation. Okay, so far, okay. I talk about the local explanation, a few techniques about local explanations. Let's go now to the global explanations, right? Which is approaching how this internal representation of the model. And here again, with the same collaborators, I'm going to explain a world where we were, in this simple architecture in that case, but you can apply this to larger architectures, exploring what was going on inside the model. So again, let's focus in one layer, like layer 5, for instance, and these feature maps that I was saying before. Let's open these feature maps, the different units, so each of the planes. And then something that I already mentioned is that each unit, so for instance, unit 1, you have the convolutional kernel, and you compute. So this feature map is representing the result of the convolution in each location. So there's this nice correspondence of locations, right? So now one thing that you can do is you focus in one unit, just one unit, and you go one by one. And you do the following. You take a large collection of images, 1 million images. And then per each image, just focusing on that unit, you observe the feature map of that unit, and you visualize the highest score for this image and this feature map and the region. So in this case, for instance, across the amount of images that we computed the forward pass, so this unit responded the most stronger number around this area for this image, around this area for this image, and so on. Okay, perfect. Then one thing that you do is we used like 1 million images, very diverse images. So now let's focus on visualizing those images that got the strongest score. So the ones that the unit responded the strongest among all the images. And what we started observing is that they were responding to visual patterns that often they have like a semantic meaning. So in this case, this is an example of a unit that it seems to be having like a preference or acting as a detector of a concept of faces in this case. But we found a lot of concepts. So some units were finding faces, some units were specializing on lamps, on screens, on baseball fields. Okay, so a lot of them had a semantic meaning. And then, so one thing that we did was crowdsourcing. So we have all the units and all of these visualizations. We retrieve the highest activations for each unit. And then we were using Amazon Mechanical Turk, and we created this adaptation interface where we asked the workers, okay, do you see any visual pattern here? So put whatever name thing you think it describes this concept, cross all the images that do not correspond to this concept so that we could have an idea of how good this unit is as a detector of this concept, because then we can compute an estimate of average precision for at least a few images. And then we were asking, is this something that is like a scene, is a region or a surface, is an object, is an object part, is a texture or a material, or it's a simple element or color, okay? So after doing all of this crowdsourcing, we realized there were a lot of units that were acting as object detectors. And notice the interest of this, because this network was trained to do scene categorization. So the only labels that we provided to the system while training is this is a bedroom, this is a kitchen, or this is a forest or whatever. But inside, there was some coherence about elements that were discriminative for the task of object of place categorization. And it was kind of discovered by the system while training, right? So, for instance, if you have a deep learning, a convolutional neural network for place categorization like this one, so what we realized is that in the layers that are closer to the input, so you could observe units that were acting as simple shapes and color detectors, so low-level features or characteristics of the image. In the middle, some higher-level things like textures, regions, some object parts. And in the upper layers, the ones that are closer to the output, you are starting to detect semantic concepts that were closer to the real task. In this case, so it's place categorization, so you already found some detectors for specific objects or scene parts. So everything makes sense, that's good, right? You see this when the system has a decent performance. So if the accuracy of the system is poor, then everything is a mess. But as soon as the accuracy of the system is good, meaning that the system is doing something good enough for the task that it's been trained for and evaluated on, then we were observing that everything was very coherent and nice, which is good. Okay, so the issue with this study that we did is that we needed humans labeling, all the units that's expensive and that's costly, so you cannot do a lot of analysis with this system. But later on, so there was this work led by David Pau, who is now a professor in Northeastern University, who proposed network dissection, which is a probabilistic formulation for doing this pairing between the units and the concepts. And for that, they were using this broadened visual dictionary. So it was a visual dictionary with different visual concepts, images, and segmentation masks. And the dictionary was collected from public data sets. So they have like more than 1,000 concepts and more than 63,000 images. And then they proposed an algorithm to do this pairing automatically. And this allowed them to analyze a lot of networks and compare a lot of models and so on. That was very interesting. And actually, this was one of the motivations for our work on interpreting phase inference models using hierarchical network dissection. And this was a collaboration with Vivian, who was a former master's student here in Northeastern, and then Sarah Stadavas, she's a professor in Northeastern as well. And here, the idea was the following. So we wanted to focus on face-centric models, so not objects, not scenes anymore, but faces. And we wanted to train these models for doing different tasks on face classification. So for example, upper and age. And then we wanted again to analyze how was the model encoding the information and whether in the model where we could observe the same pattern of having units acting as concept detectors, but in this case, concepts that were specialized on facial characteristics, right? So our motivation for that, as in other fields, we have seen a lot of improvement in deep learning based face classification models, but at the same time, it's a sensitive object. So face is a type of object, and it's a sensitive. It contains sensitive information, and we have seen concerning biases and poor performance in underrepresented classes. So we wanted to better understand what was going on inside these models and how were they encoding the information. And we wanted to explore if explainability would help us reveal biases encoded in the model, okay? So what did we do? So the same idea as hierarchical network detection. So we start with a face dictionary. So in case of a dictionary of visual face concepts, we have two types of concepts. We call them global concepts and local concepts. So global concepts are those concepts that are not located in a specific area of the face, but are more general. And we have these different types of global concepts: apparent gender, apparent age, apparent ethnicity, apparent skin tone. And notice that we have this note and more discussions in the paper that we are using here academic data sets. We think that most of these concepts are social constructs and everything is more fluid and not just binary classification and so on. But we were using these data sets to actually find biases and patterns inside the network. So all of these concepts, and then local concepts were structured in a hierarchical manner. So we have first facial parts, like the first group is eye, second group is the cheeks, nose, mouth, and chin. And then within each of these facial parts, we have specific concepts that happen in this region, like a specific action unit, right? So little movements in your face that happens in the eye area or in the cheek area and so on. Other facial attributes or objects like wearing eyeglasses and so on. Okay, so we have all these concepts. And these are examples of the face dictionary for upper and age, so different examples for the different age ranges, or for the local concepts. So here in the local concepts, if you notice, besides having the image showing this concept, we also have these segmentation masks. These were computed automatically using facial landmark detection and then estimating the region where this concept was appearing. And we needed this for our formulation of the probabilistic formulation for the unit concept pairing. Okay, so now algorithm for the unit concept pairing. I'm not entering into the details. You can check them in the paper, but basically the idea is very similar. So we focus in a unit. You have the model, it's trained, and you focus in a unit, and you go one by one. But what you do is stage one, you check whether this unit has a preference for a specific global concept. So for instance, a preference for a age range or a preference for one of the apparent genders, right? So first thing is this. Second, you check if the unit can be paired with a facial region. If the unit usually is more strongly activated in a specific region of the face. And stage three, if the unit has a preference for a specific face region, then you check if it also has a preference for any of the sub-concepts of the concept that you have within this region. Okay, so these are some qualitative visualizations. So basically, these are visualizations of units, random units that were paired with concepts in different models that we train. And we were finding consistently that objects, these types of concepts were present along the units, like, specific configurations of the mouth. Some units that were specializing on detecting the mouth like this. So this is an action unit, or I don't know, so wearing eyeglasses, or a lot of concepts. Okay, so qualitatively it was looking great. And then what we did, so we had different we trained different models on face classification with different data sets, different tasks, and then we were analyzing like the last convolutional layer, because it's very expensive to run these experiments and analyze each of the layers. And we were focusing on the last convolutional one because it was the one closer to the output and was the one expected to have most of these high-level concepts. And actually is the one that connects these high-level concepts with the output. So it's probably the most interesting representation at this point. Okay, so these are the types of like reports that we created. Let's see how they look. So in the x-axis, I'm going to show a histogram here, but in the x-axis, you have the global concepts. So all these ones are global concepts. First, the age concept, apparent gender, and so on. And then all the local concepts, right? And then we are using a color code. So all the units that have a preference for an age group are going to be marked in green. The ones that have a preference for a gender group are going to be marked in red, and so on. Okay. So, and then here in the y-axis, you have the count. So the number of units that we found interpretable, so that we found that they respond to one of these concepts. So as you can imagine, this is an apparent age estimator, right? And we are analyzing the last convolutional layer. And I'm marking age in green. So you would expect to see a lot of units that start specializing already in age ranges so that the classification at the end is correct. And that's actually what happens. So if you check all the global concepts, the most represented global concepts in this apparent age estimation system is the age ranges, which makes sense. And then for a lot of the local concepts, it's like units are specializing on particular concepts of one particular age range, so a population of a particular age range. This is how the model is encoding the information. Okay, so let's see another example. So here is apparent age estimation. And now we see a lot of red, which again, it makes sense, right? Because red is the code that we use for gender. So a lot of units are acting as gender detectors in this last convolutional layer, makes sense. And then in a lot of the concepts that emerged, the units also have a preference for a particular gender. So that's good. But let's see another example. So here, this is how the report looks like for a SMILE classifier. So you see something surprising here? So there's a lot of red, right? So there's a gender issue here. So this system is trained. So the input is a face and the output is a binary label saying this face is smiling or not smiling, right? So you would not expect to have units in the upper layers that have a strong preference for one of the gender classes, unless the gender class is providing relevant information, which is what happens here. So there were more females smiling in the data set. So this spurious correlation was learned and it was revealed by this report. And actually it happens. So in most of the, I think in all of the data sets, facial-centric data sets that I work with, there's always this type of bias. I think there's a social thing, but we always have more images of females smiling than males smiling. Okay, nice. So this motivated. So there are more experiments in the paper that you can check and reports of more models. But this, motivated this question here, which I think is very interesting. Which is, can hierarchical network dissection reveal bias in the representation learned by the model? Or here, more generally, instead of hierarchical network dissection, I like the question of, can explainability reveal biases that are encoded in the model? And here, what we did, we have different experiments in the paper, but I'm going to focus just in one so that you get the idea. So we run what we call the controlled experiment. So basically, what we did is introducing manually biases in the training set so that we were expecting these biases to be encoded in the representation of the model and then checking whether these biases are actually revealed by the explainability technique. So one of the experiments that we did is one target task, so apparent gender recognition. This is what we want to address. And then we created data sets with different degrees of bias, from balance, different degrees of bias on a specific concept, in this case, eyeglasses. So for the balanced data set, we have images of males, images of females. 50% of the males have glasses, 50% of the females have glasses. So there's no spurious correlation between glasses and apparent gender. But then for P equal to 1, so this is the parameter that controls the amount of bias, this is the fully biased data set. So all the males have eyeglasses, none of the females have eyeglasses, right? So there's a clear 100% spurious correlation on the eyeglasses thing. And then we were experimenting with ResNet, a model specific architecture. So what we were visualizing here is the following. So this is again a histogram. In the x-axis, we are going to see the different regions of the face, right? Eye region, chin region, nose region, and so on, and then the number of interpretable units that we observe for each of these face regions, and the colors are going to be the different sets, right? So P equals 50 is the balanced one, P equals 100, so the most biased ones, and then different degrees of bias. Okay, this is how it looks. So first interesting thing that we observe is that most of the units take the information from the eye region and the cheek region. This is probably because these are the largest regions according to our segmentation masks. And we are experimenting with apparent gender, which is a global feature. So the more area of the face you have, probably the better, right? So they are specializing in this. But one thing that we observe is that as we increase the amount of bias in the eyeglasses, there are more and more units that focus on the eye region because there's discriminative information that is interesting there. And there are less and less units that take care about the cheek region because they focus on where the discriminative information is. Okay, so this is a signal that we can observe in these experiments, and there are other experiments in the paper where you observe similar observations. Okay, let me briefly talk about limitations. In this case about this, but nothing is perfect. So let's discuss a little bit the limitations of this work because this one is a little bit more sensitive than the previous works I talked about. But of course, there are many facial concepts that are not included in the dictionary. So we are limited by the facial concepts that we have in the dictionary when we want to reveal biases or understand how the model is encoding the information. And second is that, as I said, the segmentation masks for the different concepts were computed automatically. And here there's a degree of error. And particularly when the concepts are occupy a very small area of the image, then you might not be able of revealing what's going on in these small areas because the segmentation masks are adding some degree of noise. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up with a few take-home messages that I like to highlight. So first of all, just as a recap, we have been talking about explainability in computer vision and these two types of explanations, like the local ones that take care about understanding the relation between the input and the output, and then the global ones that try to understand what the model, how the model is encoding the information. And then I hope that I convinced you about the interest of explainability because there are like different reasons why explainability is important. So explainability can be very useful for debugging. So for finding problems with your data, problems with your code, or with the configuration of your model. It's very interesting as well for reusing the model for downstream tasks. So that's a very common practice. It's always been a very common practice that you train a model on a task and it performs very well on this task, but then you have another task that you are interested in working, you don't have much data, and basically you try to reuse the knowledge of this model for another task, right? And in this case, the better you understand how the model works, what are the issues, strengths, and weaknesses of the model, how the model is encoding the information, the better you're going to be able of reusing this knowledge for whatever downstream task that you can imagine. And finally, auditing the model is another important aspect. So I think that explainability can be useful for bias discovery and also for fairness in AI more generally. So, okay, so this is what I had for today. If you have questions.
Talked about all the different interpretive filters in computer vision. So I was just wondering, nowadays we have all these multimodal models and we have different information from different modalities are being considered. So could you talk a bit about the interpretability for NLP or audio-based models, and how do you actually explain a multimodal?
Yeah, so the question is about other modalities and multimodal models. So nowadays we have like this vision and language models and so on. So how does it work? So some of the techniques that I talked about have been applied to other modalities. So for instance, this technique trying to see when you have units in the model, neurons in the model that act as concept detectors, this has been applied to language models as well. the way it works is that you have concepts, and then you might have a lot of sentences around this concept, and you run exactly the same type of algorithm to see if a particular part of your model or a particular unit, or it depends on whether it's a transformer or not, but a particular unit is more strongly responding to one concept or another. So you can apply this. I've seen this apply. So I've seen, actually, we played with class activation maps on audio data as well, because some audio models use image representations of audios. So you compute features, and then your audio is encoded in an image, and then you can apply class activation map, and then you can try to retrieve what are the original features that correspond to the region of the image that has more information. Regarding like hybrid models or multimodal models, I guess that one thing you can do is you usually have it's a big world, but often you have models where you have separate streams, right, for each modality, and at some point you might have like an embedding, right? So you can either try to understand the embedding space, and here you can apply the same type of techniques, right? Because at the end, the embedding space is like a large feature space. So each point is going to be a feature vector, and then you can try to find if each feature represents something that has a semantic meaning. But then you can also analyze the different streams separately, and maybe analyze the last layers before the modality is projected to the embedding, right? And also try to apply the same type of techniques. So when the models are large, it's more complex because there's more computation involved. And that's why even now, a lot of the explainability approaches focus on simpler models, which are not that simple at the end, but are simpler than these huge models, because you can play more and then get meaningful insights, and then maybe something that is successful in a smaller model, you can apply it into a larger or more complex model. Mm-hmm.
So I actually have a follow-up question to this. So because I see, all of these words, I'm kind of familiar with a bunch of them. Have very like knowledge expert features that are trying to identify and extract from these models, right?
Mm-hmm.
We see that with the face data set, and,
Mm-hmm.
with the categorical ones, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So is there a way, in your opinion, like moving forward, like do this like knowledge experts, that expert knowledge needs to be always involved in this exploration, or there is a way for more like a general framework where you notice these emergent like correlations or connections between, I don't know, inputs of your model, and find like a more general way to extract this.
Okay, so you are talking about the local explanations or the global explanations? More about the understanding of the model?
I'm talking about how do we extract those
Mhm.
concepts actually from, like, if you don't know, like, if you just given a model, you know the input and the output, but again, it can be different things. Like these models can be adapted
Mhm.
any type of input, right?
Mhm.
It's just numbers.
Mhm.
So how do we extract more in a mathematical, like, general framework this information?
Let me see if so yeah, sorry, I'm not completely following the question. So you mean without using a specific dictionary or a specific previous knowledge on the potential things that you can find in the model? Is that the question?
Like the previous, that's maybe like, let me see if I can reformulate this.
For example, if you say people an image of a bedroom, are you saying that a bedroom should not every should have a bedroom should have a bed? So are you saying that can you automate that inserting that model?
No, I'm talking about, like, for example, when you were showing the eyes and like in the face, you know that you have two eyes, you know you have one nose and one mouth, but in a signal, let's say an audio signal, you don't know where these things are. You don't know how to verify that your model is looking for those features. So
Yes.
that's why I'm saying, is there a more, like, let's say, if moving forward, is there more a general framework to identify?
I don't think there is anything at this moment. So when you work with, let's say, more abstract signals, so not language or not vision, imagine that you work on physiology, right? You might want to be interested in finding patterns in physiological signals, or even when you work with behavior. So some of the work that we do in my lab is about analysis of behavior and behavior from a computer vision perspective, right? So there are some things on behavior that you have a name for that. So raising a hand, okay, that's easy, no? But there are so many movements that you make that you don't have a semantic word for that. But there are patterns there. And then you already have a problem, because if you don't have, so first problem is when you don't have a semantic concept that you can use to name this, because then you are limited on the way of explaining whatever pattern you find. If you do some analysis that is more qualitative on a specific inputs and visualizing this, that's something that you can apply to any type of signal at the end, and then try to recognize visually the type of patterns that this, something like class activation map, but for other types of signals, and try to identify these patterns by, looking at a lot of data. But if you don't have a way of counting how many times you see this, because this doesn't have a name, or you don't even know that it exists, then it's very complex. So one thing that you can do, though, is pattern discovery, right? So you have a lot of data, and that's very complex, but you can start by doing some pattern discovery. So imagine that you have places, but you don't know anything about objects, right? But what you can do is do some pattern discovery. So try to automatically find with, I guess, clustering techniques, different representations of your data, clustering techniques, and then comparing these clusters, and then find groups of data that are similar according to some criterion, and then you put a label on it. So actually, if you think about action units, how many of you have heard about action units? No. So action units, it's a system for coding the movement of the face, right? So this was developed by psychologists mainly that were observing faces, and they were trying to find like a base of the smallest movements that you can do with your face in different regions of the face, so that any movement that you observe on a face is somehow a combination of different of these movements. And again, the issue was that you don't have a name for slightly moving your eye, blinking a little bit or whatever, right? So the action units was attempting to do that. And they were first trying to learn about these movements that often happen, and just not by observing the data, but also by understanding the face muscles, right? And how you can actually move and so on. And then this action unit system is AU1, AU2, AU3, right? But this allows you to define a name for a pattern, and then you can start counting. So I think that at some point, if you want to do something quantitative, you need some vocabulary. If the vocabulary is semantic concepts and you can use a dictionary, this is great. If not, then you have some issues. And actually, so when we were working with textures, for instance, so textures is not as easy as an object, right? Because sometimes a texture is a combination of patterns and you don't have a specific name for this texture. But fortunately, there have been people working in texture recognition since a long time ago, and there already exist some data sets where you have names for textures and visual examples of these textures, and you can rely on that and build on texture things, right? But yeah, okay.
So, thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
I just want to make sure we're getting to some virtual questions. So are there any trends between units co-occurring, co-activated together in pairs, etc.?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. Yes, there are co-occurrences. It has been less explored because when you want to quantify these co-occurrences of how often two units, I don't know. So imagine in the case of the dining room that I was showing, right? You have the table and chairs. So probably there's a lot of co-activation of table and chair in the presence of these images, and these are patterns that you can find. But as soon as you want to study groups of activations, the problem grows exponentially, and it's very difficult to address and to actually find these patterns of groups. So there are a few studies, but not many. And I think that's interesting and relevant, but I think that it's computationally a little bit complex.
take one more virtual. Thank you for the great talk. It seems that the explainability in computer vision relies on visualization tools. Can you talk more about if there are other possible ways to analyze it?
It relies on visualization tools. Well, yes and no, right? Because maybe for the local explanations, yes. Yeah, it strongly relies on visualization tools. For the global explanations, at the end, we are able to reproduce these histograms, right? Where you have concepts and the amount of units that you find that respond to these concepts. So that's not, it's a statistic. It's not just a visualization, but yeah, maybe it's right. And I guess that's a nice thing of computer vision, so that you can look at the data and see how it looks, and yeah, that's very informative. And for other signals, it's not that straightforward. As we were saying before, for the physiology, I mean, sometimes you visualize physiology, but it's not that easy.
You mentioned the categorization of objects, right? So in the final layers, we have embeddings for different objects, and this forms like an embedding space, right? So when we look at different objects, like some objects may be more related to each other, like maybe a sofa and a chair. So we want these two to be closer together in the embedding space, right? So is there any way of, we want the model to learn that kind of a correlation and that kind of a
semantic similarity among.
So, I mean, is there any way we can make sure that's happening, like while training? Because at the end of it, it may know a sofa and chair, but then we don't know if it's doing it in the way that we want it to.
Yeah. Well, I guess that in this case, you need to use visualization techniques on the embedding space, like TSNA. I don't know if you're familiar. Yeah, so I guess that the best you can do is visualizing how your embedding space looks like. But of course, you have, and sorry, the question was about the embedding space and how to understand to what extent maybe two objects that have a semantic relation, like a sofa and a chair, which are objects that look similar and have a similar purpose, to what extent in these large embedding models they get projected in points that are close to each other. So yeah, and the answer, I think that visualization techniques on the embedding space and analysis of the relative distances, right? I mean, depending on what type of distance, if you have cosine similarity or whatever, you can also compute the statistics on the distances of these concepts once they are projected. Yeah, I don't think there's, and this can be seen as an explainability technique for understanding these embedding spaces.
A follow-up question, right? When we know that two objects have a lower distance, is there a way to incorporate this in the training, like, motivate the model
to make them to be close? Well, sure, you can, I guess, I mean, maybe some graph-based approaches that use this information encoded in a way that you can incorporate in the training system. I don't have a specific example in my mind at this moment, but I think that yes, you can definitely do that. The thing is that nowadays, these correlations are learned automatically from huge amounts of data, right? So I guess that in the past, there was more this idea of trying to explicitly teach the characteristics that you want the system to learn, because there was no other way. Now we are in the large scale data sets that you can learn everything automatically, but this also has issues, right? Because we know that the data is not perfect, it's noisy, sometimes it doesn't represent all the groups that we want to be represented, so there are so many issues. And I guess that it's going to be a cycle. So at some point we are going to start incorporating again more this maybe external knowledge that you want to inject to make sure that, you adapt the thing in the direction that you are interested in. Oh, there's another. Just should we take this and then yours?
Yeah, sure. Can you use activation maps while you are training a model to tune hyperparameters to make the model less biased to certain features?
Oh, that's interesting. I guess you can. I think it's a little bit hard to answer properly and concretely how you can do that. I guess it depends on the data, on the data that you have available, and whether you have any additional maps on the images that tell you something about where relevant information or relevant dimensions are found in the image. But yeah, I don't see why not. I mean, you can have models that take multiple inputs, and you can imagine models that take as input both the original image and some maps highlighting something that you are interested in, and then creating an architecture that is explicitly learning whatever you are informing through these heat maps. So I guess yes.
Yeah, so we started with black box
Mhm.
and we're trying to make it explainable.
Mhm.
So my question is, as of now, all the models I learned are based on specific mathematic theorems or probabilistic theorems. So it's clearly we based on something that we know. So which part exactly we don't know, make it a black box?
Well, yeah, that's a good question, a tricky one. So I guess that the question is that since the models are designed in a way that they have like some kind of mathematical formulation behind, right? If it's a convolutional neural network, you know there are convolutions and there are layers and so on. Why is it that hard to understand what's going on inside since you already configured the model in a certain way? Is that the question? Yeah, because I guess that so that the main power of deep learning is that despite not being something very complex mathematically, when you take a closer look at each of the pieces of the model, the fact that they are huge, deep, and with a lot of parameters, they make them very flexible, right? So it's not that it's complicated from a mathematical perspective, but the scale of these models makes that the different values that you can give to these parameters allow the model to have a lot of flexibility and perform a lot of tasks. So then once they are trained, you don't know exactly, what each feature map is focusing on. Or even if you think about a convolutional kernel in the model, so you can visualize these convolutional kernels, right? But before visualizing, if you don't have a mechanism to explore these convolutional kernels automatically, how do you know what shape they take and what type of pattern they respond to? And you have, millions of these convolutions. So how do you know their interconnections and how they influence each other and how they complement each other? I guess that I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
Or we can think about it like simpler example, like the sun. With a neural network, we know layers and activation functions to tweak them, to activate between those two neurons to make the shape looks like a sine function. You know the sine, the cosine, like the curve. We know how to tweak those two neurons to make them align with the sine. So we kind of know like which neurons to twig in that. So it's how you deactivates those two neurons. So everyone takes it back. So I think we know exactly. Maybe it's too simple.
Well, no, I think that you gave a great example. So in this example that you gave, you can think explicitly how do you want these neurons to be, right? But you gave an example of a very particular signal and a very specific task. Now scale this up in complexity. So everything scales up in complexity, both the task that you approach and then the configuration that you need, and then the flexibility that the model needs to actually do whatever you want the model to do. And this is when, after training, given all the possibilities. So at the end, this model, once trained, it's representing a mathematical function, right? So it's getting an input, it's producing outputs and values. But so it's the same type of configuration that depending on the parameters, on how the parameters are set, it's going to do very different things. It's going to behave very differently. So you lose control on what's going on. So you understand what a convolution is, and you know that it's computing convolutions and it's going layer after layer. But then what does it really mean? How is the information captured and stored and so on? So it's not that straightforward to answer that. We can discuss this further if you want. It's very philosophical.
Okay, so thank you, Agata. This is great. Thank you so much. Thank you for the great talk. So we keep having these seminars every other week, as I said, so you can keep up with us through the website or through our LinkedIn page. And in 2 weeks, we are gonna have Chris Wiggins presenting. So follow us, register from the QR code or from the website. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming.